Hey, party people. Welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where mental health professionals sit down and talk about their mental health journeys and how they promote their own mental well-being while working in the mental health field. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, somebody I've known for a while and like to bounce ideas off of and talk about therapy and nerd out about being neurodivergent. Today, I'm joined by Kelly Loftis. Kelly, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, what's up?
Kelly, let's start with I've known you for like a little over a year now, I think.
Yeah,
Um, let's talk about how we met.
yeah. Well, thanks to COVID, there's a lot of like workshops and trainings and all of that stuff online now. So, otherwise we probably wouldn't have met because I'm in California and you're in Wisconsin.
Right. Yeah. We did training together, and what I think I said something about being pagan, and you like
Oh yeah,
messaged me on the side and we're like, hey, let's talk about that. And
yeah,
then we just kind of like nerded out on therapy stuff and pagan stuff, and it's been
yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I think there's like some ADHD stuff in there too. It's like ADHD, pagan. Hey, no pressure. You wanna like hang out online?
Yeah, did we just become best friends?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it was very cool. I think, right, kind of a silver lining for stuff like COVID of like, yeah,
Mhm.
short of going to a huge conference, which I'm an introvert, so I would have never like
Yeah.
introduced myself. So it was just one of those things where it's like, oh, this is awesome. This is a conference that we both were interested in and was meaningful. And then we connected on like some professional and personal details. That was cool from there.
Yeah, as a fellow introvert, a little on the extroverted side though, I would have thought about it. But this time I got to just like send a direct message so that I could edit. You can't necessarily edit speech in real life. So yeah, it
Yeah,
made it more accessible.
for sure. Um, I told you before we started recording what my first question was going to be, and then I totally changed my mind and called an audible there. Let's talk with my normal first question, which is how did you get into the field of mental health?
Oh wow, where to start with that answer? Um, okay. This kind of goes all the way back to high school. Like I knew I wanted to go to college. Couldn't imagine what that was. First in my family to like even think about going to a 4-year. Um, and I think when I got into community college, I was like, oh, psychology seems interesting. And I've found like interactions between folks interesting my whole life. Um, and then I think, yeah, it was in community college. I chose psych. And then in undergrad, I ended up minoring in counseling and social change. And that's where I met Dr. Sarah Kahn at San Diego State University, who's the director of that program. And that took me from maybe going like, they kept calling it clinical psych, but I don't think that's what it was. No, it was research. I was in a neuropsych research lab, and the minor, I was just like, wait a second, I really like this talking directly with people. This is really interesting. It was also a postmodern program, like pretty heavy in operating from like a social constructionist lens.
Mm-hmm.
And that was huge for me. Like it made a really big difference in like how I understood the world. And just kind of went from there. I took some time off and then applied to the MFT program after about 3 years off. And I ended up doing another master's because I applied to both programs, got waitlisted for MFT, and did the community-based block program, which was a master's of arts in multicultural counseling.
Mm-hmm.
Because I figured I'm a middle class, like white cis woman. Should probably work on some of my shit before I get into the
Sure.
helping profession, so I don't do like more damage than what I hope is good. And then after that, reapplied to the MFT program and got in and just kind of went from there. And I would have kept applying to SDSU because of the postmodern approach to therapy.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk nerdy details a little bit. Social construction.
Yes.
That's the conference we met at. We went to
Yeah.
a conference about some bigwigs from the social construction side of things. What does that mean for people who are maybe not therapists, or even the therapists who maybe didn't get trained in a postmodern lens?
Okay. So social constructionism is okay, I'm just thinking like anyone else who's listening, like don't hate me. For me, it was like that how to understand like how we make meaning and what we value through like dominant ideas and discourses from culture that's from like the broader culture, but also our local cultures too. And there's this one kind of like line I have that's like rote memory. I think it's Foucault. I'm really sorry if it's not, but it's this idea that language is a precursor to thought. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of a careful attention paid to language. So meaning that like how we describe something or what we name something informs how we feel and think about it, make meaning about it. And I guess another thing that's really important to that is knowing the different systems in which we operate and live and how those
Yeah.
affect us too.
Yeah.
How was
Social
that?
construction. That was really good. I was laughing, asking the question in my head, being like, there are like 1,000-page textbooks on this topic, and I'm asking you to distill it down in a 1-minute definition. Yeah, I think so postmodernism in general is kind of the idea away from black and white thinking and concrete sort of answers of there's a truth out there, capital T truth. And postmodern's basically saying everything is relative. Psychology as a field, this is something I think I've said in every single podcast so far. Psychology as a field moves very slowly and is always like 20 years behind the other fields. So like Einstein's theory of relativity came out and said like time is relative, space is relative, all these things are relative. And then psychology and philosophy kind of answered. So Foucault was a French philosopher who worked in the postmodern movement, and then like 20 years later, the postmodern therapies caught up to that idea that he put out in the 60s on like these postmodern ideas. So social constructionism is kind of, I would still say, pretty niche in pretty niche in the psychology world. I identify as a collaborative language therapist, and a lot of therapists have never heard of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
So the
not listed in
postmodern,
psychology today.
no, it's not. You have to write it in everywhere. The postmodern therapies are generally lumped together as narrative therapy, solution focused, or brief therapy, brief solution focused therapy, and collaborative language. And collaborative language is definitely the like smallest of the three.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you are, I don't want to put words in your mouth, you are more on the narrative side of things.
Yeah. Yeah, there's whole texts and huge conversations around like what that means too. But
Yep.
yeah, I operate from, and anyone who's familiar with narrative has like heard these. So like Michael Waite, David Epstein, and a few others. It's kind of started from like an anthropological approach, but the idea being like the problem is not the problem, or the person is not the problem is the problem. So
Mm-hmm.
the way that I like show up and talk with clients, I use questions and language to stay close to like my client's experience and like their words, but also not taking for granted what it is that we're both could be assuming what it is. And the problem is this like thing outside of the person, so that then there's some like room to find like I don't know, change or to shift, find some space. Because at least like in that theory, in my theory, if you locate the problem within a person, there's not a whole lot of flexibility.
Yeah. Yeah, and narrative and collaborative language are both really big on words, and the words
Yeah.
that we have are meaningful. They carry a lot of meaning. They don't always mean the same things to people. One of the things that I do a lot is when someone says, if someone comes in with a preconceived idea of a diagnosis, or they've gotten diagnosed by other professionals, they'll say something like, I have depression. And one of the questions I always ask, well, what does that mean to you? Because depression looks like different things to different people. So it's kind of taking, even words that our society pretends have agreed upon meaning, and really
Yeah.
like breaking it open and trying to look at like, well, what does that mean to you specifically? And making sure that the way that we're languaging matches up. and there's a bunch of nerdy stuff, I think, in the postmodern therapies around like discourse as a verb.
Yes.
So we'll talk about like discoursing, we'll talk about languaging as a verb.
Mm-hmm.
So it's super nerdy. I don't think it's like it's a paradigm shift, I think, for a lot of people, but like I think the language itself is so particular that it's not like a quick or easy read. This isn't those type of
No.
works from the philosophy of Foucault and Derrida and all those other French philosophers in the postmodern movement to like Harleen Anderson and some of the other big names in like Tom Anderson and some of those big names in the postmodern therapies, just like hard to read because they're
Yes.
choosing their language so intentionally to try and make sure that like people who are learning from them are understanding what they mean. So it's like heady, I guess I would say, more than nerdy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And like luckily, like who I mentioned, Dr. Khan, and others that I met in undergrad and even in grad school, hearing them, particularly her, like almost live out these ideas, like they're,
Mhm.
at least for me, and I don't want to speak for her, but like they seem like a value system in how you show up like as a person in your job, all of those things. It just made it so much more accessible. Well, my flavor of ADHD, like I have a hard time reading something that's like dense. And if
Yeah.
I have to use a thesaurus every other sentence, read the same damn paragraph like 8 times, cry, and then try again.
Yeah.
They just hearing her talk about it just made it so much more accessible. And I was like, I like this. And it was enough to help me like power through some of the heavy stuff. But yeah, I had to learn like kind of a new language.
Yeah.
And I still like we I play with language a lot in therapy, just like you said, like deconstructing some ideas.
Mhm.
But then sometimes I'll use words in ways that people are like, what the hell did you just say? I was like, you're right. Sorry, let me try again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it slows a lot of the process down and helps people be a little bit more intentional with the words they're using. And
Yeah.
the collaborative part for me is really powerful of like when
Yeah.
you come together and create language with someone that makes sense to both of you at the same time, that can be a really powerful experience as opposed to kind of what our brains do is take all these shortcuts with language.
Yeah.
And so even you talked about your flavor of ADHD, but like
Yep.
diagnoses are a shortcut. They're just a shorthand way to talk about a set of behaviors rather than having to list 16 different behaviors. You can just say ADHD. But
Yeah.
also, we've talked before, like your version of ADHD is different than my version of ADHD is different than someone else's version of ADHD. So there's 20 different symptoms of ADHD and you need 6 of them to get a diagnosis. So there are all these different iterations that can exist out there that have little or no overlap and still get the same diagnosis. So we do kind of have to break these things down. And I think it helps for people coming to therapy to kind of see some of that. They don't need to, I've never told someone, well, I don't want to say never. I probably have. I rarely tell clients like, "Hey, you should read Foucault." Like it's not like a thing that you need to do the heady work or read this French philosopher or anything like that. I love Foucault, but that doesn't mean that like it's necessary. Again, the concepts aren't particularly hard. It's just a little bit different way of doing things to make your brain pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were saying that too, I was thinking, well, what keeps me here, but what also drew me to it, like with postmodernism and social construction too, is remembering that, well, psychology in general, but still like therapy, all of it is still like very white male Eurocentric, including the
Yeah.
DSM. And like we're trying to catch up, but like we're not
Yeah.
there. And like what you're saying with diagnosis, like it's different for everyone. And then on top of that, like there is like a filter, there is a lens that was used to arrive at these things, at these like diagnoses and like explaining symptoms and all of that. And it doesn't fit for everyone.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge fan of breaking that down and pointing that shit out like in sessions so that if a diagnosis is necessary, I don't work with insurance, so I get to ask that question a little more often. But we go through all of that, and so far people seem to like it. And I've had like, I think one client that he's like, okay, hold on, this is too much. So then we like figured out how to make it how to talk about it together in that way. But yeah, I
Yeah.
find that incredibly important in my practice.
Yeah, and I think like in social construction, there's this idea of like dominant discourses, and there are the ideas that like a lot of the way that we use language in agreed upon way is based solely on our social background, and it's not because the words have meaning themselves or that they are important on certain things. Like there's value that gets ingrained in people just based on the society that they're born into. And so
Totally.
being aware again of like language is loaded and that these words have meaning that has been arbitrarily ascribed to it because of some sort of cultural thing. Like you were
Yeah.
saying in psychology, a bunch of old white dudes getting together and deciding that like these are the things that we think are normal and these are the things that we think are problematic. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's definitely, I think, helpful, especially around terms of mental health. And if you're working with anyone who's coming from that not white male Eurocentric backgrounds, like a lot of times they've been harmed or at least like done a disservice by the medical field or the psychology field using the medical model.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Um, Another part of I don't really know how to verbalize this, but I guess like another part of my practice or something that I find like valuable, a way of thinking that's valuable is a common factors theory.
Hmm.
Is a theory, common factors, something.
Yeah.
But just this, of course, like how am I going to break that down? Uh, Basically, like me, there isn't necessarily, it seems to me like there isn't necessarily like one theory that's like the best. Like it's all relative and
Yeah.
nuanced and yeah. Um, and oh, I was going to tie that in to something that you just said, but just a second. But anyway, that's something that I find really important. And it's
Yeah.
something that helps me like remember like me showing up as me. Like I'm pretty good at establishing relationships. Like
Hmm.
I want it to be warm and genuine and like just the fact that someone names something like common factors like helps me remember like, oh, I'm an important part of this equation and the
Yeah.
relationship that we're able to establish.
Hmm.
And maybe I'll remember later the reason that I was thinking of
Well,
that.
and common factors is a little bit newer. It's kind of like a couple different, I think a couple different therapists were involved in putting it together as basically like, what does the science tell us? And let's build a therapy out of what research tells us, as opposed to
Yeah.
trying to have a philosophy first. And basically acknowledging that the research shows over and over again that the most important indicator in whether someone has a good experience in therapy or not is whether or not they have a relationship with their therapist.
Yeah.
And so common factors kind of says like, it doesn't matter what school of thought you come from, what techniques or tools you use. Here are the best practices that any therapist can use in any school of thought and still build rapport and still be respectful and still do good work with somebody assessing for safety and all this stuff. So like,
Mhm.
yeah, I think common factors is really great. I've seen common factors. I don't know if it's even older than it might be older. I know I only started hearing about it a couple of years ago. So
Mhm.
maybe 5, 6 years ago, at the most, I would say, where I've really started to see it. And then now I've seen it probably at every conference I go to, but it's still, I would say, a little bit more fringe. Like it's not it. I've talked about this in other episodes. There's a dogma to some of the psychology, the school of psychologies, where
Yeah.
people are like, "Oh, you need to pick a school of thought, and you need to practice from a certain perspective." And so, I think there's a resistance to something like common factors. When I was going through grad school, like being an eclectic therapist was a bad thing. You weren't supposed to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
So, even though nearly every therapist draws from multiple schools of thoughts or draws from different techniques that are outside of their school of thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the folks that I float with that are kind of like in my community, um, there's I forget who said it, but they had suggested like, oh, maybe like this whole like picking, I don't know if you use this language when you were in school, but like picking this like theory to date and eventually you'll like marry, and we can even get into that interesting use of language, but
Yeah.
that where it's it's like the theory is being valued more than what you can bring to these relationships, and there isn't the same value placed on hey, we're already coming to this because we know some things. We know some
Hmm.
things about how we want to relate, and like that's so valuable. Um, and yeah, so it'd be cool to see if we could change some things in grad schools about like, well, what is it that you know about relating and established relationships, and then like add like, hey, so these are some of the ways that we can approach like therapeutic conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That gets into a little bit of a separate topic on our education system.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, there was something that like it's a tangent now, but earlier it wouldn't have been that I kind of wanted to jump back to.
Hmm.
Um, when we were talking about like dominant discourses and like the lens through which the DSM was created, uh, it remind I was thinking about too like what that meant for me when I was trying to seek my own diagnosis around
Hmm.
ADHD. And my poor psychiatrist, when I called him, I immediately, one of my first questions was like, hey, this is kind of loaded, but I'm wondering like what you might think about the gender bias in diagnosing ADHD. Like, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to ask him. I just knew like, hey, I want to approach this and talk about this.
Yeah,
Because at least for me, seeking out a diagnosis was an incredibly like vulnerable thing to do.
sure.
And props to him, he handled that like pretty well. He's like, actually, that is kind of loaded. And I was like, cool, game on, let's do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting experience. When did you get your diagnosis?
Oh geez. It's 2023. It might have been fall winter 2021, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, COVID really highlighted some stuff that I thought I already knew, and I was just like, here we go.
Yeah, but so you're already in the field. You'd been in the field
Mhm.
for a while. You'd done multiple grad level
Yeah.
trainings, like very much knew a lot about psychology, and yet still didn't get a diagnosis. Where we think a lot of times, I think people think ADHD gets diagnosed like in late elementary school or high school. Like I
Hmm.
didn't get my diagnosis till I was in my post grad. Like I was done with my master's and like had completed very high level of schooling very successfully, and I went differently than you. I was like, I need to go get a formal diagnosis because I've been saying I have ADHD for years and people have been ignoring me. So I need to go get the formal diagnosis so that I can like show people like, oh no, like this is a thing. I manage it okay, or like I mask it in enough ways where you don't see it, but like it
Yeah.
affects me on a lot of ways. And
Hmm.
so I think, there's this whole idea of like a deficiency around a diagnosis that just isn't there either. I like using diagnosis as shorthand as a way to explain as just a set of behaviors and like not right or wrong, good, bad, or otherwise. I think the research continues to show that something like the DSM or the medical model is pretty short sighted and doesn't actually hold water once we start expanding it across different demographics and looking at it in cross cultural lenses, because a lot of the research that was done by English speaking people only. So, like,
Yeah.
it's such a limited body of, and not that the research is useless. I've talked about this before too. Like
Yeah.
we don't just throw out all this body of evidence and say like, well, that doesn't work. Like there's utility to it, but you have to know what its strengths and its weaknesses still are. So
Yeah.
I'm going to go way back in
Cool.
your history here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, was education like a thing growing up? Was like education a thing that was prioritized where you were like, I want to go to college, or was like helping people? Like what was kind of the draw for you as far as like
Yeah.
how you picked a major and all that kind of stuff?
Um, oh gosh. How did I do that? Um, I don't know. A big part of it, I was just kind of like flying by the seat of my pants. I was like, I don't know, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And okay, so I remember, so I went to a really small high school, and anything aside from like the basics of what you needed to graduate, in order to like meet, I can't remember any of the regulations, but to meet expectations if you wanted to go to a college, like that, my school like kind of met that.
Yeah.
um, and anything else was online. So I took AP Bio online, and Psych was one of the ones that you could take online, but it had to be like an AP course.
Hmm.
Um, and I knew that was one I wanted to take, but I was in my senior year by the time I realized that. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll take one in college. It seems like I like people. I find this interesting. So then I just took a couple of classes in undergrad, and in every single class I ended up taking, I still kept finding people interesting. I almost went into
Yeah.
sociology, but most of the time I was learning about like what is this college thing as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I
Sure.
think it wasn't until I was done with undergrad that I was getting a little more sure. But at least at that time, I was more sure about what I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. But a big part of it, I just enjoyed learning too. I didn't have fun with education until undergrad. Because I
Hmm.
struggled quite a bit. I mean, I got like decent grades, but I struggled quite a bit in elementary, middle, and high school.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Which is I think a common
Unsurprising.
experience
Yeah.
for people who get diagnoses later in life. I work with a lot of neurodivergent folks who get a diagnosis pretty late in life. Sometimes I'm their first diagnosis of ADHD, and again, not in a deficiency sort of way, but
Yeah.
just saying like, hey, like it's helpful to know that your brain is doing these things without you thinking about it. Like your brain's always going to do it this way, whether you like it or not. Like this isn't just
Yeah.
like, learn how to be organized like a regular person. Like this is an idea of like, no, this is your regular, and like there aren't regular people. Society wants to pretend that liking Excel spreadsheets is normal, but like I would argue it really isn't. So
No.
I think for a lot of people, like because they do well, or if they like escape with good grades, whether they're personally miserable or whether it's a lot of extra work for them, or whether they're just masking all the time, they are like, well, can't be that bad because I graduated. And it's like, well, that's not the way it works always.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, that was something that I think I talked about that with my psychiatrist. He was like pretty transparent about how he was thinking about things, which I loved.
Hmm.
Um, and he was like, well, you seem like pretty successful, so I'm not so sure about this, but like just thinking about it. And we got to dig into more of that a little bit, like, and something that it's really interesting, like this part in my life, like right now, where I'm at right now. I realized like a lot of that success is because I thrived on the structure and deadlines of school.
Hmm.
Like thrived as in stuff got done. We could talk about shame all day. That got baked in there.
Yeah.
And like the not understanding why, like I'd sit down to write a paper and it felt like I was just slamming my face into a brick wall. Like, why can't I do this?
Hmm.
And like with my diagnosis, it was helpful, well, validating something I kind of already knew. Um, gives me like, well, one helps me step away from shame in some ways, but that's a sticky trap I'm still unwinding.
Sure.
And it's just giving me like a direction for like how to reapproach some things instead of doing the same thing over and over again because that's clearly not working.
Yeah.
Yeah, I lost the first part of that, but
Sure. Happens, right?
yeah, yeah,
uh, I think it's fascinating to me, and I think one of the things that like has been interesting just getting to know you a little bit is like coming from different backgrounds and like different family setups and different things, like how many factors, how many different like personal experiences we kind of share the way that we reacted to something or felt about something, even though like the outside world saw something different. So like I'm
yeah,
cis het, like privileged in pretty much every way other than like my family was pretty lower class, maybe lower middle class, but we were poor growing up. But like all the other privileges I had, and yet I had like a miserable time. I was even raised evangelical, so straight white male, even more privileged in that setting. And like I had this huge like fuck the police, like middle finger to the law. Like I hated authority. I was miserable. And like there was this sense of like some part of me knew that I wasn't fitting in, and it was so much extra work to like maintain relationships or like not think not think that I was super weird. I remember like feeling like everybody was going to figure out someday that I was just like too weird to be friends with. And it was like this
yes,
exhaustion around like, yeah, because like my brain does things differently, but nobody assessed me, nobody diagnosed that stuff. Like, oh, Jeremy, you get good grades, so that's good enough for us. And like I often say like I was miserable because it was so much work to maintain just like a regular level of functioning, even though everybody else was like, you are awesome. None of this is hard for you. That must be so great.
Yeah.
School's not hard, but like talking to the kid who sits next to me in class is exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, for me, like so many like similarities. And then like my like flavor that what was different. It was hard to focus on obviously on some things in class, but like socially, I was really interested in like socializing with other people.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, I knew there was something like different about me and like yeah, like you said, like kind of afraid that like they'd find out I'm too weird. And like had a lot of trouble like in some ways connecting, but then would like find out later, like I have this memory of like going back to my elementary school because my sister was there for like a carnival or something. She's 2 years younger than
Hmm.
me. And running into some kids and they're like, oh yeah, you know, you were so nice. And I'm like, wait, what? Okay. Um, and that's something I know about myself now. Like I at least I've been told, and I think so. Like I'm pretty like warm and genuine and want to make that connection. And sometimes I can get like stuck in this, especially like with teachers when there's some kind of injustice that's happening. Like,
Hmm.
oh, that's hard for me. It's really hard for me to like come out of that. Or when I know something to be right, like capital K, no.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's when it was really hard, and there's a lot of friction with my peers, with some teachers, although the like fear of getting in trouble and not wanting to stick out really stamped down a lot of things I think otherwise probably would have been caught.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
like people are like, oh, like you don't have like the H in ADHD. I was like, oh girl, that's inside.
Yeah.
Squirrel in traffic in here.
Yeah, I definitely had the H. I was that kid who was like out of my desk every hour or more than once an hour. I had all these extra jobs. Like I always talk about, this makes me sound so old, but it's just because I went to private school. Like I was the kid who took the erasers and clapped them out from all the chalk dust because when I was really young, we still had chalkboards. And like so
Yeah.
I like put the flag up in the morning and took the flag. Like I had all these extra jobs because I was just like constantly out of my desk. And she'd be like, Jeremy, do your homework. Like I'm done. They'd be like, work ahead. I'm like, I'm about 3 weeks ahead. What else can I do? Because I was just like so painfully bored. Like I was doing
Yeah.
homework just because I was bored, not because it was fun or interesting.
Yeah.
So it was just like, yeah. I look back, I'm like, man, how did nobody see what was so obviously ADHD? And yet, again, I think society standards of like, if you get good grades, you kind of get ignored. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Like I was afraid to move. That actually really like came out that I remember reading the criteria. I don't know, it was probably in undergrad or something, and then again in grad, and then afterwards of like difficulty like staying in your seat. And then I just started laughing because I was like, oh, that's a thing now. Like I find
mhm.
every excuse to not be in my office and to not sit down. But like it was just kind of like overridden in a way, and it almost seemed like it went like internal
Yeah.
when I was younger because I did not want to get in trouble because that like perceived like rejection was so painful that that was
Hmm.
enough to like freeze my body.
Yeah.
Well, except for that, my one leg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always the leg shaking. I was
Yeah.
a tall, skinny kid for a long time because I think I burned so many calories just having to sit still.
Oh yeah.
Which is wild. It comes back. I have a 5-year-old and I went to a parent teacher conference and like almost instantaneously. And like I sit all day. I do therapy. And like I think a lot of my clients wouldn't know I had ADHD if it didn't come up organically because like I'm
Mhm.
not. I'm like that's so stimulating for me that I don't bounce around, that I'm not
Oh,
like
for
needing
sure.
to stim. And then like parent teacher conference hit, and I was like, oh man, this is how I used to like sit all the time, like leg bouncing, cannot sit still, shifting in my seat. It's like, oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
that. When I'm unstimulated, sure, comes right back.
Yeah. 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 Particularly like God, I remember that in grad school, like being in class all day long. Or even trainings at work. And luckily, like, at least I don't know how it is for others, but in my program, other people that I hang out with, like, it feels like a lot of folks are kind of like breaking this idea of like you have to sit down and like face forward. There's usually like a few people in the back like doing like figure eights with their hips and like stretching and still watching, and it's like recognized that that is like us paying attention and taking care of our bodies. And I so love when that's reinforced in adults so that maybe we can change some of that perspective from when we're sitting with kids.
Yeah.
And that was a game changer, like being able to move. I could pay attention like so much more.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, I mean, at some point it became problematic for me. I think in grade school or in grad school, definitely high school, like I didn't take notes. I like nothing on my desk, or like I'd have a notebook, but I'd be like scribbling cartoons or whatever. Like in grad school, like people would get mad at me. They'd be like, "Why aren't you taking notes?" I don't know how to do that. Like I've never
Yeah.
needed, I don't do that. I don't know. And like I'd roll into like a test and everybody like cramming their notes and be like, "Jeremy, did you study?" Be like, "No, study what? I don't take like, no, I didn't study. Why?" And
Yeah.
like again, just that like othering of like not fitting in. Like I did not understand. I thought grad school was really easy. And so like I didn't understand not only like what people were stressed about, but also like I just remember like watching people take notes and I was like, why are they writing this stuff down? Like the professor's talking about vacation. Like what's going on? And
Yeah.
so like I was always kind of like in and out, like daydreaming or doing whatever, and just kind of like I think managing my own symptoms without realizing that's what I was doing. And then like I luckily have a pretty good memory where if I like hear half of something, I can usually pull it out. But like school was geared towards just sheer brain power. It's not like I was smart. It was just that give me multiple choice test and I paid attention to like 40% of your lecture, I'll do all right on it. So
Yeah.
but yeah, just that experience. And then I think it wasn't until like after grad school, post grad and everything, I got in the field that I started to like find all these other like neurodivergent folks. And it's like now I joke about like we neurodivergent people, we find our way to each other. Like
Yeah.
there's just
People in the crowd like
yeah.
hi.
I joke with my media person is neurodivergent, and so we joke all the time. So we'll just send like blocks of texts of like a laundry list of things we've meant to like check in with each other that neither of us do, and then one day we're all like firing on it. So here's like 16 tasks we need. Don't do them all today. I'm just thinking of them all today. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So what was like your journey for your mental health then as you were like kind of going through these things? It sounds like you were aware that like ADHD or something was there, but you didn't get diagnosed till later in life. So what were you kind of doing to like navigate or manage that without having something like, hey, this is how your brain works?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm definitely like still in the middle of it, but so back, I think this was post grad. So chronologically we're talking like, I don't know, 2017. Um, I think it kind of started with just trying to have some grace for myself and not being like, um, I don't know, interested in further shaming myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then like COVID and being home and like losing all of the structure that I had before. Um, Once that highlighted it, I was like, okay, I get it now. And um, I brought up with my therapist. This is different therapist than I have now. Postmodern therapist, and we did like some cool work. And just, I brought it up with him to just kind of like spitball, like try out this language, try out like telling someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, it really, I was gonna say like I don't know how I got this idea, but I have an idea how I got this idea of like it was like trying to use it as an excuse
Mm-hmm.
or being like lazy, not having time management. And like, well, if I just tried harder or I had more discipline, then I could do it. And like, and we know that's it's kind of fucked and isn't helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I talked about it with him, and that was really helpful to just like get the words out. And then I went to my primary care provider, and it took a lot. So actually, I'm skipping something. I'm gonna go way back for a minute. I think this was in 2012. Um, One of the jobs I had, I noticed I was having a lot of trouble with it. And so I think I had like different insurance at the time, and like insurance providers can make a really big difference in the type of help you can get. And I
Yeah.
did get formally assessed before. Um, and honestly, I don't know what the results were because I just remember that psychiatrist saying, "Oh, you don't have ADHD, it's anxiety. I don't do therapy. Here's this medication." Like no talking about it. And my boss at the time like filled out like one of the take home surveys, and then my parents filled
Hmm.
out one too. But I remember that conversation with my parents, like, you don't have ADHD, there's nothing wrong with you. Like, why are you asking about this? I'm like, no, okay, let's talk about like some stigma that might be around there.
Yeah.
Um, and that was enough to just like completely shut me down because it was like, oh yeah, I have anxiety, but there's something else here. Like I
Yeah.
know something else is here. And there was a part of me that like even like, well, little me was like pretty fiery, and she's still in there. And she like was, there's kind of this like background voice that's like, this isn't accurate, and I've been carrying
Hmm.
that with me, and that's got louder than back to more like present times, when talked to my primary care provider, who was amazing, um, and then explained to me the system in which he operates, and that they are not allowed at this provider to diagnose and treat ADHD, and so then he had to refer out to
Hmm.
psychiatry. And who they were referring out to. I wasn't a real big fan of that idea. So luckily I'm privileged like just enough to be able to afford private practice
Yeah.
psychiatry. And I know that is not accessible to most people. If it wasn't for my HSA, I couldn't do that. Health
Yeah.
savings. Um, and yeah, but I just did some searching online. Luckily, I already have those skills to know like what
Hmm.
to look for, and found my current psychiatrist. And it was just so nice to feel like heard and
Yeah.
understood in that first evaluation conversation.
Well, and so this is a good example, and I think ties back to what we were talking about earlier about some of the biases in the profession, and certainly the difference between diagnosing for males and females. I work with a tons a strong word. I've seen over the years a lot of females who got diagnosed with anxiety, and I generally feel like a better diagnosis would actually be something like ADHD, and the symptoms that society sees or other people are seeing are symptoms of anxiety, but the
Totally.
anxiety is around fear of not fitting in, or fear of
Yeah.
like showing your true self, or fear of rejection. And so
Yeah.
these are things that the neurodiversity is causing or
Yes.
creating, I would say. And then the symptom, the masking, is the anxiety behaviors, but that's what gets diagnosed. And so then
Yeah.
they're learning all these calming skills or these self-care skills around anxiety, and the thing that's still causing the anxiety is unresolved, and so they stay anxious.
100%. Yeah. And like other things too, but like even for me, like socially, I experienced some trauma that I'm like, oh, I think that might have had something to do with me not fitting in and what stemmed from that. And I guess clinically speaking, like we do, like if we're working with insurance, we need to parse out what different symptoms could be to then give that diagnosis. And like, yeah, there's a decent amount to parse out, like for me, but I think you're right on. Like for me, um, like it's like starts with ADHD, and like anxiety definitely comes from that. And like where I'm at now, I'm working with a therapist I actually saw in undergrad and grad school, and she's amazing. I love her so much.
Hmm.
We're doing some somatic work.
Yeah.
And there's some like, I think DBT in there, but I've like purposely, I can't define DBT, by the way, like dialectical behavioral therapy, but I couldn't tell you about it.
Yeah.
And like we have like a great relationship. We kind of already had that history, and I knew that she took a somatic approach, and I knew that I
Hmm.
wanted to get a little more in touch, a lot more in touch with my body.
Yeah.
And that's been like exactly what I needed.
Yeah.
It's yeah,
Yeah, and I think, we're talking about some diagnoses, but I think some of these things are, again, using diagnosis as shorthand. Like, I think if you have neurodiversity, understanding how your brain works and how it's wired is necessary.
yeah,
Necessary is maybe a touch strong, but not too
Yeah,
much. Like
I'm
I
okay with
really,
it.
and then something like trauma, right? Like trauma
Yeah.
is another thing that I think gets misdiagnosed all the time. And the diagnosis itself isn't important, but like to understand, like, this is why your brain is doing what it's doing, which is
Yeah.
causing your body to do what it's doing. And no, it's not this other thing that gets diagnosed, whether it's depression or it's anxiety or whatever, or it's about a personality disorder, right? It's one of my soapboxes to be like, hey, personality disorders are almost always trauma. Um,
Yep. Nope. We're
that
on that
like
same soapbox.
yeah, that if it's one of those things where it gets diagnosed the wrong way, then you're walking around with the shame or guilt of a
Mhm.
heavy diagnosis like a personality disorder, when really it's something like trauma. And if somebody just would take the time to explain, this is how trauma works, this is how we heal
Yeah.
from trauma, the approach is totally different.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Like I'm feeling because of like where I am, like the steps I've taken like in my journey, I'm starting to feel just more like at home in my body and like
Hmm.
teaching myself like to trust my body. Um, and this has been it's been one of the hardest things I've ever done. And it's the
Yeah.
thing I think I'm the most proud of.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's very cool. If I was a better podcast host, I'd end there on like such a powerful, proud moment, but I'm not. I'm going to nerd out on other things.
Let's
Um,
do it.
So I want to go back and talk DBT, because DBT is one of the things that I do. So
Yes, please.
dialectical behavior therapy is it's I'm oversimplifying strongly, but I like to describe DBT to people who aren't in the field as it's basically like Buddhist philosophy for Western civilization. It's a lot
Nice.
of mindfulness and breathing techniques and emotional distress tolerance. So like there's a lot of skill building in it. And my reason for using DBT is I come from a background with working with a lot of athletes. So I was a coach,
Yeah.
I played sports myself, I spent years as a director of student athlete mental wellness, working just with student athletes. And DBT was like a really easy way to get people into their bodies, out of their heads and into their bodies, without it seeming like we were doing emotions, because I'm working with a 300-pound offensive lineman who doesn't want to talk about his feelings. But if I can get him breathing and paying attention to what's going on in his body, and he's motivated because that's going to make him a better football player, well, all of a sudden we've got something to work with there. And then
Yeah.
there's very little resistance versus like, hey, let's talk about your feelings, which I think
Yeah.
is what a lot of people think therapy is. And some therapy is like that, but some is very much body work, and is the somatic movement, especially around trauma, I think is really helpful for a lot of people, because
Totally.
they have disconnected their brain from their bodies, thinking they're separate things, but they're not.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, my therapist just pulled, I think it was out of a sexual trauma workbook that has a whole section on working with your body.
Hmm.
And she pulled out, like, made some copies for me, like a movement that you can do to try to move like some anger or any other like really big feeling
Yeah.
through your body. And I was the one in grad school or even like younger, like acting out something felt weird and I hated it.
Yeah.
Like having to like role play in grad school. Oh God, I hated that. But I tried it. I was like, I think there's something to this. This is really helpful. In fact, I tried it before today to just like settle my body and to like throw like some energy out. But and it was kind of funny because when we were going through it, the way it described it, I was like, oh, I can see how this completely ties into pagan practices, and I'm so down with that.
Yeah.
Can't wait to tell the witches in my circle about this.
Well, and that's the same segue I was going to make into, like, for me, ritual work has been really difficult, because like
Yeah,
I'm an intellectual and I'm comfortable intellectualizing. And so doing something that is not very scientific is like hard for me. And I think some of it's being an introvert too. Like I'm uncomfortable. I was raised evangelical. And so I was raised with these ideas of like, pay it, like, don't offend other people, don't bother them. Like I was raised to think that was in charge of other people's emotions, which now I know is incorrect and super unhelpful, but it's still very much a part of me that like I'm aware of what other people are doing and I'm thinking about what other people are thinking. And so if I'm doing something that like is kind of anti-intellectual, which is not how I feel about paganism, but when I was getting into ritual work, I was like, okay, but like we're not actually doing anything here. And so I
Yeah.
really had to kind of like approach it from a science-based thing of like, okay, you already do mindfulness work. You tell people constantly how good it is for them and how great it is for them. And yet you're not practicing it yourself because you think it's awkward. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, it's still work. I think it's an ongoing process for me, partially from a
Mhm.
religious background, getting comfortable with something like pagan practices, but also just getting
Yeah.
over like this is weird and like it's okay that it's weird and it doesn't need to not be weird. It does, no one cares. Like get out of your head and just let your body do the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Because kind of a little bit of a tangent, but like when you're describing that, I remembered, well, I just watched an episode of Ted Lasso last night. And one of my favorite things about that show, aside from, everything and like hitting on all these things around mental health, but one of the characters does this thing where she'll kind of like crouch down and then like pull herself up and be like, I think it was a lion, like in the mirror. And just doing this like body movement, like I'm so glad that I'm seeing more of this in media.
Hmm.
Because then maybe it'll take some of the weirdness and shame out of it. I don't know. I mean, that's purely anecdotal and completely from my point of view, but like it helps seeing like, oh, someone else does this. It's not just like someone
Yeah.
says to do, you actually get to see it done.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's nice to, start practicing something so I don't feel like I'm like talking out of my ass to my clients.
Yeah. Well, and like without calling it ritual, I've recommended that for a long time with people, especially if I'm working with um, any sort of minority group, whether it's people of color or it's females or whomever around certain emotions, to be like, give that like a voice. Like, let's go somewhere
Yeah.
with that. Like, a lot of times it's like, oh, like these females, for example, just use females for example, we're told to like journal. Like you don't need a journal. You're pissed off. Like you need to go punch something. And just because like you're a girl and you're like a dainty societal, socialite, like in the 1850s, like no, go take a kickboxing class. Go like chop down a tree. Like you're mad. Like let's give that somewhere. So like without
Yeah.
having the background to call it ritual, like these are things that I've been working with people on in the professional side of things. And then just I had this mental block for so long. I have a lot of like, not a lot. I'm getting better, but my work is still like deconstructing some of the religious stuff. If even getting
Mhm.
comfortable around like a religious setting to do something like a ritual with a group of people. I'm very much still on the solo practice kind of thing, but it's yeah, I
Yeah.
think there's all this like social or psychological effects to it that I've known for a long time, and it's just applying it in a different context.
Yeah. Yeah. Since I've been like with my group of folks that for like pagan type stuff, um, I didn't know what to expect from it, and going to rituals and just being like, okay, we'll see how this feels. And I think I've been able to get more out of it, or I don't know, like I don't have to cave to like people pleasy perfection, like ideas, like I got to show up in the perfect way. It's more like I can just check in with my body and see like, how is this? Do I like this? And at least like I feel like my group is like really, there's a lot of importance around connection, like
Hmm.
placed on connection, connecting with others and doing this like ritual that I don't, it just makes it feel a little more approachable. Um, and like kind of like you were saying, like with the intellectual piece, I'm like, this translates so well for me.
Yeah.
Of like holding space for each other and like even just the different like visualizations and stuff that we might do. Like I might not think, I might not define magic the same way as some of the others do, but it's still a very useful like concept and word, at least the way I'm defining it.
Hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah. Not magic like turning lead into gold, but magic as
No.
like a psychological concept.
Yeah, yeah. And it really helps too that um their kind of like title for it is like the keepers, is they're very much about like you do you. Like as long as you're
Hmm.
not like hurting anyone and we're like keeping tabs on like these are our values and this is like the area in which like just pay attention to these, don't hurt anyone else, like value these people, then you just kind of do it your way and that's been really helpful.
Yeah.
Also, like, I have a really great imagination, so I have so much fun. Like, my inner, like, 5-year-old is just so jazzed every time I go.
Oh yeah, well that's wild because I was going to talk a little bit about like one of the things that's helped me come out of that shell a little bit is having kids. Like my
Oh, yeah.
2-year-old right now, he's adorable. He's just like a very like cute little dude, and anybody who calls him cute, he scrunches up his face and goes, "I'm a big strong guy," and like flexes or he raises his arms above his head, and he just has like these very like he's so expressive in his face, but he has these like wild over the top gestures. And I'm like, yeah, like that was me as a little kid. And as an adult, like I stopped, like I was trained to stop doing that. Like, don't call attention to yourself or don't bother other people or whatever. And it's like, no, like this
Mhm.
is like, that's his power stance. I'm like, I'm here for it. So,
Yeah.
like, honestly, like seeing how my boys kind of do some of that stuff and like experience it by acting it out or experiencing it through their body as opposed to intellectualizing it is like, oh, yeah, like that's, we're wired for that just as much as I'm maybe at this point wired for being an intellectual. Like, it's not like that
Mhm.
part went away. I just stopped doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Over time, we get, like, more rigid, I think, about, like, something being, like, petrified.
Yeah.
Like, our bodies just get, like, so stiff.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm trying to remember what one of my mentors said, like, when she was talking about her son, about how she was taking, um, like, a pretty intense stance, like, that she didn't want, like, either school or the different systems that he was living in to, like, I'm not going to use her words right, but, like, take, like, his sparkle.
Yeah.
Like, the thing that makes him like him, she was it like more than not interested. Like, she didn't want to see um like society like change him or
Yeah.
expect him to show up differently, um other than in his like very wiggly body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and like as a parent, that was a big thing for my wife and I too, just to be like picking a school that made sense. Like I was miserable in school with my ADHD not being diagnosed, so I didn't want like my son to be somewhere like that. He's a very small version of me, so he's probably got some of those neurodivergent traits as well. And so it's just like right finding a school where like he can go outside every day. There's like a tree fort in his classroom. He's not doing homework or worksheets or anything. Like it's very
Yeah.
sensory based and like he's a little bit like me where he doesn't maybe love all the songs and the singing, but like it's coming out and he loves the actions and the movements that go along with it. And so it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
like that's awesome.
Yeah.
I didn't feel that way about school. I didn't
Mm-mm.
like it. I didn't want to go. So yeah, yeah, it's crazy. Um,
Yeah.
you already name dropped Ted Lasso.
Oh yeah.
So one of the things I like to talk about. Let's talk. What's on your bookshelf? What have you been reading recently, or what are you kind of like
Mhm.
absorbing in the field a little bit, or in the like mental health side of things?
Yeah. Oh, let me like pull it up. So, well, one, we're like can't wait every week for an episode of Ted Lasso.
Yeah.
And I was watching Brett Goldstein as a writer and actor on Ted Lasso, and he's also a writer on Shrinking. And
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed that show. Let's see. There was a book I just read. I think it was called Making Friends with Monsters. Um, and I picked it up at the Bay Area Book Festival. I'm trying to remember her name. If I can't, then we'll just like put it in the show notes because
Yeah.
this was a book written from the perspective of like I think like a 12 or 13-year-old. And it was using the metaphor of monsters to talk about like trauma, suicide, suicidal ideation, um, and it like she covers some like pretty big stuff in that book, but from this perspective that, and I think I either read or saw an interview where the reason that she wrote this, I think, forgive me if I don't have that right, was to just introduce this idea or give something to kids about like how to think about this and try to navigate this. I think I cried like 3, 4 times, like reading the book. One of the easier books to read, certain like for
Yeah.
youth. But it's yeah, just finished that one. And I highly recommend it for teens, even for families to read together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, What else am I reading? Yep. Reading's a whole thing. What else am I listening to? Let's put it
What
that
else?
way.
Yeah, podcasts, audiobooks. What you got?
Yeah. I really like Maintenance Phase as a podcast. I've been listening to always Very Bad Therapy.
Mhm.
Um, Snacks. That's a not a mental health. Actually, they covered plenty of mental health. That's with Sam Mewis and Lynn Williams, who are they've been on like the women's national team, this women's national like soccer team. They're
Mhm.
both in the NWSL, and I just love hearing like their insider experiences on like the game, their lives, talking about mental health. And then is that it? And I just really like listening to like murder mysteries.
Yep.
Specifically ones that have like some kind of like I don't know, like Irish or English accent, because it just like helps me like go into another world.
Sure.
Particularly when I have to do things that I don't want to do, like cleaning the kitchen.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
Little special tip there. Listen to your Irish or English accented murder mysteries to help get household chores done.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And like God, the production value of audiobooks has gone up like so much. It's lovely. Like even when I am reading it, my husband's like pretty good at accents, so I'll have him read like the first part of a book, like Ton of French with someone I was reading, and they all take place in Dublin. And I'll
Mhm.
have him read it to me in kind of like a Dublin Irish accent, so then I can get it in my head and keep reading like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually some
Very
kind of
cool.
story.
Mhm. Awesome. Um, yeah. So and then Ted Lasso is a big thing. Ted Lasso, I think every time you and I talk, you recommend it, and I still haven't
Oh yeah.
watched it. And a lot of people talk about like the mental health concepts in it. So it's on my
Yeah.
list to track down. Um,
Nice.
did you finish Shrinking? Because I've heard mixed reviews on.
Yeah. I think. How many seasons has it been? Whatever is available to watch, I've watched it.
Sure.
And there's some things that I'm just sitting there like, okay, that's not gonna go down well. And then I have to remind myself, like, okay, that like what we would do in therapy isn't really the point. Um,
Yeah.
and I think I probably told you about this, but I heard an interview with Brett Goldstein. I think it was Fresh Air. Um, and he was talking about just like what he finds interesting to write about. I think the interview asked him about writing about therapy, and hearing him talk about like his own experience and how that's informed like Ted Lasso and Shrinking. Yeah, I just found that really interesting and helped me when those parts when I cringe in Shrinking. Remember the point, and yeah, and all the acting in it I think is flawless. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful writing.
Very very cool. Well, Kelly, this has been awesome. This has been a good encapsulation of, I think, like our regular neurodivergent conversations that are
Yeah.
wide ranging and follow a lot of tangents.
Yep.
If people want to find out more about you, if they want to track down your work or would like to work with you, where do they kind of go? What do you have out there? What's going on that side of things?
Yeah. Well, you can find me on my website, kellyloftis.com. We'll put that in the show notes, yeah,
Yep.
to help with spelling. I do have a psychology today, but it also links to my website, and so that's usually
Sure.
the easiest thing to find.
Yeah. Very
Yeah.
cool. And I'm Jeremy Schumacher. I'm everything I do is at wellnesswithjared.com. I'm on Instagram and yeah, this has been a real treat. I'm glad you were one of the first people I thought of to get on the podcast. So I was excited because I knew we could talk about nerdy therapy together.
Oh yeah.
So this has been awesome. I'm so glad we got to find time to sit down and record. Thanks so much for coming on.
Same. Thank you.
And to all of the listeners out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to follow us and wherever you listen to podcasts. I've had a couple people who tagged their therapists to get them on an episode in the future. That helps me connect with maybe some people I'm not familiar with or haven't had a chance to collaborate with. So tag a therapist, tag me with your therapist, and we'll try and set it up in the future. Everybody, thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week. Take care.